You mentioned something called open banking earlier. Could you talk a little bit more about that as a concept? What does that mean? We're shifting gears a little bit right now.
Yeah, sure.
And what does this term mean?
Okay. So for me, principally it's a European and UK thing, albeit we do see similar things happening in other countries. It's very much being driven by regulator, and to a certain extent it sort of does what it says in the tin. It's about the opening up of banking, so promoting a degree of innovation, competition and access. And the way that it's doing this is by setting out the context for users who own their own data, which is held by a bank, to share that data with other providers, such that if another institution, large or small, new or old, has something interesting and value-adding that will help you with your life, on the basis of consuming that data, you can provide access to it, whether through an API, whatever it happens to be. So what that means, really, from my perspective, is that there's an opportunity to provide a high degree of control from a customer perspective as to who you give the access to, what they use it for, but also how I control my own finances and who helps me with that. And married to that is choice and customization. So the degree to which I can choose what I consume, when I consume it, how I consume it. And then finally, I think perhaps most importantly, perhaps to this conversation, is this notion of coverage. Mm-hmm. So there are, and I think I very much agree with the point about it's not just an emerging market challenge with respect to financial inclusion. Then there are segments of our society who are not covered. Mm-hmm. For whatever reason. It might be about creditworthiness, it might be about a degree of understanding and education, and therefore the opportunity to increase that coverage on the back of some of the services, whether fintech driven or established institution driven, that are digitally enabled to provide what an individual needs in order to manage their financial life. So it ceases to become about a specific product or a specific service. It can be about a goal, for example. So I'm saving for X, Y, and Z. I'm trying to get out of debt. I've got certain expenses coming with respect to my children or my home. And interesting ways in which the data that is to a large extent sitting relatively unused inside financial institutions today can be used to better understand behaviour, spending pattern, give advice, and take some of the difficulty out of decision making, often to help people who don't feel qualified to make those decisions. So
if I were to try and paraphrase that, if I'm Barclays, for example, I have been transacting, or I'm a customer of Barclays, let's put it this way. I've been transacting with various parts of Barclays, various products. Over the years, I've built different data points through my transaction history. Now, open banking concept is something Barclays can adopt to offer like a personal financial management tool of some sort that allows me to plan ahead, or is it more of an industry thing?
So it's yes and no. So there's another actor perhaps we should talk about. So in that construct, so you're the Barclays customer. If another institution, established or fintech, mini pocket, depending on what they decide to do with their app, comes along and says to you, this is what I can do for you to help you manage your financial life, to give you interesting new services. And you give the permission that the other institution can consume the data that Barclays is holding for you, and therefore that data is no longer exclusive to that single institution. And that's really the opening up point. And that is pertinent to certain elements of customer data and transaction data, and also elements pertinent to the initiation of payments. So that the proposition can not just be information-led, but have an element of execution informed by that information. Probably the important thing to point at this point is there is a regulatory framework for this in Europe and in the UK, a big part of which is the General Data Protection Regulation, so GDPR, which is one of the points that was raised earlier, is very much about permissioning, understanding access, auditing of access, such that the information that's required to deliver service is shared, no more, and only for the duration of the delivery of that service. So again, it's back to that control and choice point I made earlier.
Just talking about this new world that you're talking about as well, and I refer to it as a new world in terms of, a bank becoming a data store or data source for my transaction history. So will I end up getting advertisements for insurance because I look for something somewhere from a bank, which is worse than what I get today?
So that's a really good question. So I think part of the challenge, and I think we've talked a bit about earlier today about education and awareness and understanding, and so that may be literacy and numeracy, but it also might be a fundamental what's going on question.
Yeah.
And I think from I'm just getting flagged by I'll talk quick. But I think so when it is explained. So firstly, when people are spoken to about open banking regulation called the Second Payment Services Directive (PSD2), all with the same sort of goal, they just don't know. So it's an awareness point, because if people don't understand it and don't know about it, they won't adopt it, and the benefit it may bring won't come. When they begin to understand it, there's this moment that I think asks exactly the question. She also says, "Well, hang on a minute." If I'm going to share this, am I going to get peppered with spam? And a colleague of mine refers to it as being brandalised.
Where that's a good one.
Where all this stuff comes hurtling at you.
That's a good one.
I'd love to take credit for that, but I have to give you the footnote. And I think those risks do exist. Although I think part of the aspect around permissioning, I think, helps with that. And so from that perspective, the question then becomes, what is useful? And the reality is financial services are pretty boring. We don't really want to do it. It constitutes a list of things to do that usually doesn't put us in a terribly good mood. We probably feel a bit guilty because we haven't done it. As the question is, through the clever understanding of the data and some of the smart technology, and whether it's applied to an existing bank or institution, or indeed to an emerging one that has similar intent to provide a more open, accessible infrastructure. What can we do that solves some of these problems? So it becomes less about, here's a big long list of stuff and now you have to make another choice you don't feel totally well informed to do. Here's a slightly more relevant list of things and some guidance to go with that, based on the understanding of who you are and what you do, based on an understanding of when the money comes in and out of your account, based on whether or not it's sort of ad hoc payments for someone on a 0 hours contract, for example, versus a more regular salary. Someone who's got a regular salary, a direct debit generally can sit there because it all syncs up. If you're on an unexpected stream of income, it's very hard to sign up to a direct debit because you're never quite sure if the money will be there when the direct debit goes out. And that control and flexibility is something that we see and we hear people are looking for. And there's an element of potential in that around something like open banking, and also in other work that's going on at industry level here in the UK to provide some of the underlying infrastructure to allow for those sorts of services. So I would hope not, is the honest answer to your question. And I think there are controls in place to minimise that. I think it's much more about something a bit more targeted and more personal to, as I said earlier, the goal that I'm seeking to achieve, as opposed to just pushing more product.